Good morning. www.andrewmarkmusic.com. This is the Winter Solstice Golden Rule Series, part 11 of 12. And I'll preface this one by talking about a very controversial subject, the JQ, known as the Jewish question. And I will give my thoughts on it from my somewhat idiosyncratic Gnostic perspective, Christian Gnostic perspective. Yes, there is such a thing. I guess, where do I start? I believe it's historical fact that some, if not many, of the first Jewish Christians were Gnostic. That is to say that they came to understand, probably in my opinion, through being taught by the Christos, who was not Jewish and was not a carpenter, that the God of the rabbis in the Torah was a false architect. I don't believe that these people would have hated themselves, and I don't believe that they would have hated other Jewish people or the rabbis. I believe that they would have been very controversial. They would have had to deal with a lot of really, really intense conflicts. To me, it's more consistent about what pissed the rabbis off, you know. This version it seems more coherent, that, you know, telling them that their God is a, you know, somewhat evil, false architect most likely would have put them into a rage. So I've got some fresh juicing going on here. It's also the Roman festival of Janus. Don't know why we have this in the New Year. It's obvious the New Year's in March in the Northern Hemisphere. Okay, so where was I? I also believe that this particular Christian Gnostic view explains a lack of historical evidence. Why there isn't any, and why what there is like Swiss cheese with academia as far as history goes. I believe that he did show up at that time, the Gnostic Aeon, Christos. He did teach, you know, various people at that time. He did get into conflict with them, with the rabbis. They did want to kill him. Yes, all of that. But there was a version of this story created that I don't believe to be true, and I believe it's incoherent. I have a hard time really understanding the Christian version of Satan. Even why Christians find it so hard to believe that the Old Testament God is Satan when it's demonstrably verifiable. I mean, Dr. Richard Carrier has got 24 verses, and you don't need the doctor, though. You could just read it for yourself and see that this behavior is something else. So, you know, the other issue then would be when did this Satan come into existence? I mean, clearly in the book of Job, you know, Satan is serving God, you know. So when did he turn into Satan? When did he turn into that other Satan? Because the official story of Christendom is that was Satan in the Garden of Eden. Okay, so it's very confusing. Now, as a Gnostic, first of all, I would say that Satan and Lucifer are two different entities, archetypes, whatever you want to call them. In my opinion, probably real. Satan is, as described in the Old Testament, a servant of the demiurge, an archon of the demiurge, who does exactly as described. Apparently they love wagering, and Lucifer is a replicant of Sophia, the wisdom that came into existence with the Logos and the Christos. But that's speculative metaphysics. Yeah, so that's my view on it. I don't see why this became so controversial as far as, declaring Gnostics anathema and to be hated and murdered. Like I said, they wouldn't have hated themselves. They would have projected love. It would have been very important to be kind to those, because Christos would have taught that. He would have taught them kindness. He would have taught them, how to be loving and things like that. So, yeah, it's a bizarre situation. I believe that the Gnostic view of evil is a more coherent version of Christianity. Nevertheless, it is what it is. I had an interesting little strangeness happen today. I was talking about the two streams of religion that are coming into play today in yesterday's post about the about Lucifer, fulfilling the promise to turn us into gods which will be through artificial intelligence, and the Messiah trope. And within the Garden of Eden, there was two trees. Now, it doesn't say what kind of fruit they are. Most people will say one was an apple. So you have the tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For the sake of what I'm going to tell you, I'm just going to make it clear that I'm using two apples loosely for this. Because when I was on my walk today, on a very high bridge going over a piece of ocean, there were two apples, just beautiful apples, strategically placed in the most precarious of places today. I didn't touch them, I didn't pick them up, I just left them there, I walked by them, but I did take note of them. And I know this is definitely strange sounding, but for that to happen, like this like 1 in a billion, there's no way two apples should have been sitting where they were. Not any chance whatsoever, but they were there. And I just found it sort of amusing in the context of what I talked about yesterday. Obviously, I do believe, although I frame it as speculation, I do believe that all these things are happening, that this is really happening. Now, I've questioned in the past if the atheists are right and if the materialists are right, and we get the Noahide laws, all based on delusion. How insane is that? Yet it's happening. I don't think there's any doubt that this is happening. Now, personally, I don't agree with the atheists and materialists, so I think this is really happening. Yesterday's post questioned whether it's really God and angels, archons, or whether it's actually E.T., so I don't have the answer to that. This series of posts was mostly for those who still consider the idea of spirituality important. Included in this demographic would be any atheists who still consider some type of spiritual view, perhaps philosophical naturalists and such who hold pantheistic views might be interested in this. It's time to take a moment to consider my position on capitalism, but I'll preface by saying I reject the dualist control dichotomy of the capitalist communist. In my opinion, that duality is a modernist control machination implemented by the usual suspects. I don't own property, and property probably never will. Although if I did own, I'd only buy one property that would satisfy my needs. I don't exploit anyone's labor for personal gain or profit. I run a small legal proprietorship, which means today that banks, corporations, and governments are at war with me. This is because I refuse the corporate model of doing business, what I call the Unholy Trinity, and make no mistake about it, if you are not for the Unholy Trinity, they will wage war against you in every way that's legal and sometimes illegal. To be frank, if one is friends with this group, then one simply hasn't been asking the right questions. At any rate, any sustainable capitalist model has to end income via exploitative rent seeking. Using force, coercion, and unnecessary exploitation to earn a profit from someone else's basic needs of food and water has to end. In my New Earth Commons model, I also see the need to end neoliberal debt slavery for education. And a new healthcare system needs implementing, one premised on a healthy foundation and not the present capitalist model of healthcare, which seeks to profit from an extraordinarily toxic system. Ending the toxic system would be the saner approach. I've pointed out the lunacy of the cost of maintaining this present dysfunctional system. It's staggeringly expensive, and it'd be far less expensive to implement a healthy economic model. Obviously, a sick and unhealthy electorate is very easy to control, especially when splintered into thousands of warring factions arguing over what little scraps are thrown from the table. The four pillars of a New Earth Common civilization needs funding by a non-debt public means of exchange via something like public banking or a non-debt currency like positivemoney.org. Let's be clear here, this model is premised on the hopes of civilization surviving 100 more years in a healthy fashion, something that is quite questionable under the present system. The crown and the cap, so to speak, with this model is it also doesn't break the only spiritual rule that really matters, the golden rule, which was always relevant to the trading of goods and services. In this model, capitalism would still exist, but would have to reinvent itself by earning capital in creative, non-toxic ways. Charging humanity interest on housing, food, water, education, and healthcare would have to end. This is an old predatory mindset, perhaps justifiable in 1850, but now just a prisoner death sentence for civilization in the next 100 years. Perhaps a timeout is needed for 70 years or so. The foundational basic needs economy would need to be educated or re-educated and become a culture of people attaining their highest potentials. I call it a culture of attaining mastery. Of course, a re-education away from cynical misanthropy would be needed. A large part of a new education model would be to teach every type of personal food production, which would reconnect humanity to its earthly roots and end the disassociation implemented by the capitalist machine. One intended to control food production for oligarchic agendas and profit. A one house per person policy would end homelessness, unsustainable hyperinflationary real estate speculation would end, and would realign humanity with the ethics of the golden rule. Buying and selling one's personal dwelling would still happen, but there would be little inflation or profit motives involved. Within the new commercial capitalist model, the buying and selling of real estate for commercial purposes could exist similarly to what exists now. A fiat currency could also still exist and be used in this economy. I see this as a sane compromise between the unending war between people like Karl Marx and Adam Smith. I need to touch on Buddhism for a moment. Of the two major schools, I'm more sympathetic to the Theravadian view in that other dimensions exist and are real and are populated. The Mahayana school's view and its universal conclusions come from experiences with the human mind. Fair enough as far as it goes, but I can't for the life of me see how one can draw universal conclusions definitively from experiences within the human mind. Admittedly, this is a Christian Gnostic take on it. I've also mentioned in earlier posts that I'm more sympathetic to dualist Dvaita Vedanta philosophies. Nevertheless, Buddhism, no matter which school, is consistent with the golden rule economy. Why it's not in practice today is a very interesting question indeed. I'll finish up with thoughts on crypto tomorrow. I'll also briefly touch on women and the gay community as they relate to these issues over the coming century. I just want to touch on a little bit more on what a Christian economy might look like. And if anybody wants to add links to this video where such a country exists, that would be, I would like detailed links if you have them. A Christian country would have to create its own currency. The currency, in my opinion, would not be a commodity currency, because a commodity currency is likely to get hoarded. So you want to take away that impulse, that negative impulse of hoarding. The other very important aspect of a Christian currency would be that it has no debt mechanisms associated with it. The current currency creation is all tied to very sophisticated debt mechanisms, which are there to hide the fact that it's a Ponzi scheme. You know, whether the money would be, how the money would, the currency would be distributed, who knows? I know that in mid-century, before the Zionists took over Alberta, that there was a social credit trying to be implemented there by Christians. So maybe some kind of social credit currency would work. But nevertheless, it has to be something that would be congruent with Christian values. And I talked about this in the comment section yesterday. Christianity, the word loses its meaning if we can't define it. I mean, in a rational way, in a healthy way. I mean, to me, the millions of Christians, whether Amish or whoever, that are living similar to the Book of Acts, are more Christian than Christians like W and Obama, who murder Islamic people, Muslim people for Israel. I mean, this, I don't know why this is so problematic. You know, it should be a very simple thing that a certain way of living as a Christian is more coherent and congruent with what the Christos would have taught. Now, this of course is separate from religious theology. I've pointed out in this series that I believe that Christians, no matter what the truth of Christian theology, that they should not interfere with the coming of the Jewish Messiah. Okay, you shouldn't try and stop that. But there's nothing, in my opinion, there's nothing that I can see within my opinion where Christians should accept being enslaved by a usurious cabal of people who are hostile to them. So this is where I think the focus should be. So, yes, that's it. This is AndrewMarkMusic.com, The Golden Rule, Winter Solstice Series, Part 11. I'll say Happy New Year in the spring. Peace out. I woke up